Hi, it's Mr. Lawrence, and we're now in our fourth video for the Civil War. We did a couple last week where it ended up with the Battle of Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Union finally win or hold the field in one battle, even though it's the bloodiest day in American history. And then afterwards, 5 days later, Lincoln is going to use that to be able to announce his policy that any slaves in the rebelling states are now going to be set free. However, going into the next year, so that policy is in effect on January 1st, 1863, and there's celebrations. A lot of the old-time abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and William Lloyd Garrison, they all get together and celebrate, but they know a lot more needs to be done. They know the Union has to win the war, and the war aims have now changed. So here's your first slide for today. And these are actually pictures of when Lincoln went to the battlefield to visit his soldiers, which are pretty cool. And they've even colorized some of them nowadays on the internet. But the war aims is that Lincoln now says that it's including black freedom. At first, for the first year of the war, he was very, very careful. He did not want the border states, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, the states that had slavery still, to jump ship and go to the Confederacy. Because heck, if Maryland goes to the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. would have been an island all by itself, surrounded by the enemy. So he had to be very careful. He said the first was, we're trying to save the Union, we're saving the country. But now he knew that in order to get the spirit of his men up, to get the spirit of the country up, to give the war and all this blood letting more purpose, it had to include black freedom. And there's been a lot of debate about, how anti-slavery was Lincoln through his whole life. During the war, he gives one letter, which is more of a strategy letter than anything else, to this one newspaper critic. He says, "My paramount object is to save the Union, and it's not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could see it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that." Now, that letter is written in 1862, before this Emancipation Proclamation comes into effect. And the Emancipation Proclamation kind of lets Lincoln be free. It kind of lets him to actually follow the beliefs that he's kind of pent up through his whole life. Because he grew up dirt poor out in Kentucky and Indiana and Illinois when he was younger, and he worked as a flatbed operator down the Mississippi River. He saw slavery firsthand as he went further in the South, and he empathized with those that were suffering. And he said that, I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. But he was also a politician, and he knew that for a lot of his career, he had to hide or dance around what his true feelings were on some of these issues. In 1850, if you were out there saying, "I want to get rid of slavery everywhere," there's no way you would have won anything. And finally, he often had these sarcastic quips, which he had no time for people that try to create these long-winded explanations for why slavery was okay. He said, "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves." In fact, at one point he suggests that those people that are always praising slavery should, try it for themselves, give it a day or so and see how they would do. So Lincoln here is able to elevate this war. But the next several weeks and months are going to go terribly. For the end of 1862 and the beginning of 1863, the Confederates are just running roughshod over the Union Army. McClellan is going to be fired. He never chased Lee. He had a chance to chase Lee after Antietam, and he didn't do it, so Lincoln was finally done with him. And he's going to put in charge a guy named Ambrose Burnside. And yes, these fancy sideburns here, whiskers. Sideburns is nicknamed after Burnside. They just inverted the name. So this dapper-looking guy was very stubborn. And that stubbornness is going to cost a lot of people their lives. So here is the Battle of Fredericksburg. There is a stone wall, and the Confederates are at this stone wall at the base of a hill called Marie's Heights. And the Union are going to come across, and they're going to try to go up this hill over 14 times. And What do you think is going to happen? Well, it's going to be a slaughter. Probably the most one-sided big battle in the war. The stupidest battle in the war, probably as well. There's just this old school mentality of, be brave, stand in a straight line, stand straight up, charge the enemy, even if it's from, a mile away, even if the enemy's in a defensive position and behind rocks here. If we just have more numbers and more will and we just keep doing it, we'll eventually win. Well, that didn't work. And this is in December too. So what happens is they charge up this hill time and time again, the bodies start to pile up. And because it's just a shooting ground there, even at nighttime, there's no way to get to the wounded. So you had soldiers bleeding out here on the cold, frozen ground in wintertime, just bleeding out and suffering and moaning all night long. Because, if they got up, they could get shot. Friends couldn't get to them. It was a horrible experience. What happened is the town of Fredericksburg was here, and the Union they spent all this time getting across the river, the Rappahannock River, and they wanted to get to the heights. And Lee was smart. He kind of forced himself off into a distance here up the hill, knowing the Union have to go a long way to get up to him, all the way across this field, all the way through the town. And that was after they got across the bridge. They're going to be tired out. They're going to be really obvious targets. And it did not go well at all. This is a picture I took. This is looking up the hill. So pretend you're a Union soldier looking up the hill. There's people with guns monitoring you right here, about ready to shoot you. And they had cannon way up higher on the hill. So a pretty imposing sight. And nowadays, it's only like maybe a tenth or so of the actual open field. A lot of the rest of it's built up. So from where they were coming, it was from much farther away. There's still bullet holes in the one of the houses that are there. And this is kind of what the behind the stone wall looked like after the battle. You see a lot of discarded weapons, a couple dead bodies, but it's a pretty solid defense here. A couple years ago, they made a movie called Gods and Generals, where it's a good recreation of what the battle would have looked like in terms of how far away they had to go up. So the Union's wearing these light blue winter coats, and the Confederates just blasting them. And over time, you see the Union have to charge this position. So the Confederates are here behind the stone wall. The rest of them can go down and hide below when the others are reloading. And the Union are just sitting ducks here. The commanders are just barking orders, and as they go up and down the row, all their people are going to get shot. And there's no defense. There's no shelter for them. It's a pretty dumb idea. You can see people losing an arm here. So not a very good strategy. And they go back to Burnside. They go back to Burnside and say, hey, this charging the stone wall, charging up the hill, probably not a good idea. And he says, you know what, we got to take it. We got to take it. We got to take it. And he keeps going. He keeps telling them to go over and over and over again. Finally, they have to beat off a retreat. But look at how many bodies they left in their wake. And they do this again and again and again. And there was real resentment and anger about the commanders of the army. So after Fredericksburg, there's going to be a new commander for the Union. But he is not going to do much any better. And this new commander for the Union is a guy named Joe Hooker. And he was kind of more of a wild figure. Some people say he liked to party and drink. There was a rumor for a long time that the word hooker even came from his name, but that's been debunked in the years since then. But he is going to be the next Union commander at a battle called Chancellorsville. And at Chancellorsville, it's another Confederate win thanks to Lee's strategies. In this one, he's outnumbered, and yet he decides to divide his force, which is something you don't usually ever do when you're outnumbered. But he wants to catch the Union napping. So this is really the highlight of Lee's strategy. And like I said, there's a lot of controversy about Lee as a historical figure and fighting for this cause, which is not the best cause at all. But there are some definite military tactics that he did that were brilliant in battle, especially against some of these hapless Union commanders. So Joe Hooker is the new Union commander. Here he's a dapper-looking guy, and he just gets caught kind of like with his pants down here because his army is just camping. They're out in a big open field. They're not really ready for any battle, and they're going to get surprised. So Hooker's camping out here, and this is all woods. You see the green is all woods. And so what Lee decides to do is divide his forces and takes one wing of his army under Stonewall Jackson, go all the way around through the woods, and then attack them like in the front here, and they would not even expect it. So left flank all the way around, and then be able to almost like encircle them. Because then if they would try to get away, oh, look, Lee's right there. And then if they try to get away this way, oh, a creek's right there. So it's like a perfect maneuver that could just cause mayhem. And there, again, they have a good recreation where the Confederates literally come out of the woods and they surprise the Union camp. And here they are. The woods are not that far away from the actual Union soldiers. This is supposed to be Stonewall Jackson. And they come up out of the fields. The Union are just sitting there, and then they're going to have to scram and try to run away and try to put up a fight, not being well prepared at all. So sitting around, some of them are in underwear there, just with their regular old outfits on and eating, and they are going to have the whole Confederate army bearing down right on them. Now, the Union do put up a brave fight. They try to regroup and spur of the moment, but eventually the Confederates are going to win. A lot of hand-to-hand combat here as well. So the one weird thing at the Battle of Chancellorsville is Stonewall Jackson, the guy that we saw, he was Lee's second in command. That night, on his way back to camp, he was out scouting positions. He was shot by his own guards, by his own pickets. So there was like these, what are called these pickets, which are at the outside of an army's camp, and it was night and it was dark and raining, and they didn't know it was him, and they shot and it hit him in the arm. And his arm actually gets amputated first, and they bury the arm. He's one of the rare people in history that's buried in two places. And then another week later, he develops pneumonia and he dies. And so Lee is able to, or Lee is really distraught because, he makes this comment about, Jackson's lost one arm, but I have lost my other. And then eventually Jackson dies. So in the North, obviously, people are going to be upset. We keep losing over and over again. Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Bull Run, the Peninsula Campaign. And there's a lot of blame going around, a lot of blame at Lincoln. And there's a group called the Copperheads. The Copperheads are people that are in the North that do not want the war to continue. They say it's not worth it. It's not worth it fighting for black freedom. It's not worth it keeping the South in the Union. Let them go. We'll be fine on our own. We have a lot of factories anyway. They're protesting the fact that there's a draft being instituted to get soldiers. Now, most soldiers were not drafted. Only about maybe 2 to 10% or so were drafted. And most of them were most soldiers were volunteers. But just the idea that the Army could force you, conscript you to be in the military was bothersome to people. And there was a riot, especially in New York City. And some of the riots almost didn't even have much to do with the war. It had to do with some racial things and some class things, especially the fact that you could pay to get somebody to be in the war as your substitute. If you're rich, you were able to pay $300 to get a substitute. Here's a poster saying, avoid the draft, substitutes, $300 government bounty for 3 years. So somebody else, some poor schmuck, would have to go fight for you for 3 years, and you're rich and get to, live in your mansion in New York City. And in the movie Gangs of New York, they do a good job showing the draft riots that took place where some of the poorer folks came into the richer neighborhoods and rioted, and they grabbed weapons. The police had to try to break it up, and then they were assaulted. And these are all, now this is Northerners against Northerners. And this is all New York City. And then finally, what has to happen is the Union Army has to come and they have to protect the locals. So the Union Army is already busy worrying about Lee down in the South. Now they got to go up there and rescue some of the population. So obviously a lot of issues in the North. Maybe one bright spot in the North is that finally, after all these horrible battles, they're developing a system to try to deal with some of the wounds. And one of the people that is heroic in that effort is Clara Barton. So there's this nursing system and ambulance system and medical system that's able to be created for the Union Army. They didn't think at the beginning of the war that they would need to have a system for, tens of thousands of battles or wounded in one battle, but that's what happened. And in Antietam, they realized that they were getting so short they were using, corn husks as bandages. So there was no way that could continue. They had to set up a system of triage. They had to set up a system of moving supplies like bandages to the front, having each unit with enough, medics and bandages to at least stop the bleeding. And the goal was to get people to, off the field within 6 hours, and then eventually having a surgery if they needed one within 24 hours. So instead of leaving them out there wounded on the battlefield, bleeding to death, if there's a chance to save them, get them off in a couple hours. Put a tourniquet on them out there on the field, get them in, get them cleaned up, get them into a field hospital, these tents, have the nurses, take care of them until the doctors can slowly get to them, and hopefully within 24 hours they can do the surgery. And eventually the amputations got down to about 10-minute long. And the guy actually that was in charge of the Union Army's medical system was a guy named Dr. Jonathan Letterman. He was from Pennsylvania. And his system was able to save some lives. So especially in Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, when the casualties were so bad for the Union, and Gettysburg later on, he and Clara Barton were really important in saving people's lives. So that is going to be our last note for today. Next video, we will see the biggest battle of the war.